Hello everyone, thank you for joining us for this sectional. My name is Hilary, I'm in Toronto right now. I'm a church musician serving a United Church of Canada congregation near downtown Toronto.
I am Andrew, and I'm currently in Coconut Creek, Florida, and I serve as a church musician in an Episcopal congregation here in Northwest Broward County.
Before we carry on, I would like to acknowledge with respect that I'm filming this presentation on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples.
And I on the lands of the Ais, Tequestra, Mississauga, and Seminole nations.
I acknowledge that I'm a settler on this land whose First Peoples continue to cry out for justice.
We'd like to begin with a little bit of an advisement. We will be discussing topics including gun violence and death. We'll be sharing from our experiences of walking with our communities through the aftermath of mass shootings. We should say at the beginning, it is our firm hope that you will never have to use any of this information. But should you find yourself in a similar position to what we've experienced, having the tools and resources to handle it will be extremely helpful. There'll be a PDF document that accompanies this presentation, which includes a repertoire list, additional resources, and an outline, although you won't need it for watching this video.
When violence like this happens in a community, people need ways to express their fear, their anger, and their grief. When we are overwhelmed with the pain of loss and beset with uncertainty, singing has the power to express things that words alone can't convey. And as church musicians, we think a lot about how community singing can bring people together in times of joy and celebration. But equally, in times of grief, singing is a way to express how we feel and to move toward healing.
Our presentation today is structured in this way: a brief overview of each of our experiences, strategies for the church music leader in times of tragedy, questions to ask ahead of a community ceremony or vigil, and a look of repertoire that could be useful.
But first, let's sing. The protest song, "We Are a Gentle, Angry People" by American singer-songwriter Holly Near speaks to the competing emotions that can come to the surface in the face of adversity like this. It begins, "We are a gentle, angry people, and we are singing for our lives." You can add additional verses to this song or improvise them. We are young and old together. We are gay and straight together. We are all in this together. And the phrase that ends each verse, "singing for our lives," reinforces this idea that sharing in song can be a way to reclaim your voice in the face of an unspeakable situation.
On February 14th, 2018, I was the Assistant Director of Music at St. Mary Magdalene Episcopal Church in Coral Springs, Florida. The day began interesting as it was both Valentine's and Ash Wednesday. Around mid-morning, we began receiving news that there was an active shooter at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School, a high school that serves all the local communities in the area and was only about 5 to 10 minutes from our church. We didn't know who had been shot, if anyone was killed. the whole day was just full of chaos as news came in. As of 7 p.m. for time for our Ash Wednesday service, we had already decided to make changes to make it more of a time of prayer and just mourning in the wake of what had happened that day. Our assistant rector had given us word that all of our youth were accounted for, and although we were still in a terrible state of shock, we thought we had a little sigh of relief that all our kids were okay. The following Saturday, the choir was meeting for a Lenten Easter music rehearsal, during which our director of music became ill and had to leave early. As he was leaving, our rector came in to speak with us to let us know that, in fact, one of our own, Carmen, who sang in our choir, was one of those who was killed. We were just completely devastated at the loss of Carmen, and we spent the rest of the time just kind of talking and sharing our feelings with each other. Because our director had gone home ill, the rector pulled me aside and asked me to actually plan the music for the funeral. And while I planned music for funerals before, this was something of a different magnitude and something I'd never, had done that was on such a large community level. I asked the choir if there were any pieces that they knew that Carmen loved, and we had discussed that we had recently done Farley's Requiem, and that would be great. And one of our favorites was Rudder's Gaelic Blessing, and we knew that that would be something that we would want to include. I reached out to one of our pianists who was Carmen's piano teacher, and she let me know she was going to be visiting the family that evening, and I asked her to ask the family about what kind of music that they may want in the funeral, and she said she'd be more than glad to, and even offered her own playing of a piece that Carmen had been practicing for some time, which I thought would be fantastic for the offering of the funeral. Afterwards, I reached out to Dr. Michael Hahn, who was one of my professors at Perkins School of Theology at SMU, and he helped me focus my mind about what I was going to be doing, and gave me the image of thinking of a state funeral, and that it was something that was more than just for the family or even the church, but for a whole community, and even one that would have dignitaries attending. Looking at having music that spoke to all those people, things like Amazing Grace and Oh God, Our Help in Ages Past. This gave me a little bit of a focus of what to do, and likewise I reached out to my fellow MSN grad colleagues and who gave me some great support through this time and helped me as I kind of focused my ideas about. By Sunday, I realized our director was not going to be able to play. He was our organist. He was not going to be able to play Tuesday for the funeral. So I began reaching out to some of the local organists, and the director of music at All Saints Episcopal Church responded that he would be more than glad to play for us and that he would bring his choir along. And in fact, 2 other parishes, including First Methodist in Coral Springs, sent people from their choir to come sing with us. And it was just one little moment of solidarity that we were, as a community, were coming together for this. Monday, we got to go to the space. The rector and I visited the Monsignor at St. Andrew's Catholic Church, the church where we'd be having the funeral, as it's at 2,300 versus our 450 in our sanctuary. We discussed what the service would look like. Of course, our rector asked if we'd be able to have Eucharist, because that is a typical part of funerals for an Episcopalian service. And the rector said that he had already talked to the bishop and that it would be totally fine for us to do that. Our rector, also being someone who's a big supporter of ecumenicism, asked the Monsignor if he would like to be a part of the Eucharist. which he called his bishop. And not only did he get approval to be able to be part of it, he was actually given special permission to co-celebrate with our rector. A wonderful moment of, again, community support through that. In fact, when we went to the sacristy afterwards, the Monsignor offered to use some of his chalices alongside of our materials in the celebration. It was, again, just overwhelming. I got to meet then with the director of music and discuss things that were important, like where should the choir be, how does sound reproduced in here, should we have microphones and all that. And again, just all this overwhelming stuff where she just stepped in and said, I will take care of making sure everything's where it's supposed to be. Tell me what you have and I'll make sure it's ready. I also happened to grab a hymnal so I could get the page numbers for the hymns out of their hymnal, which was a good thing as we ran out of bulletins. There were so many people attending. Tuesday morning, we got there and all of the musicians gathered early so we could go over the music. We began singing and it just came together. A group of 44 singers who have never sung together in a group just blended, and it was just an overwhelming show that everyone was there working together to make this as best as possible in honor of Carmen. Throughout the service, we were just in this spirit of awe that we could be a part of something that was so much bigger than ourselves. Not only was the sanctuary full, they put chairs out through the aisles, and even then there were a large number of people standing in the back. The show of support from our community to come out for one of our own, one that maybe they never met, but they felt connected to through this whole tragedy. It just left us all in this overwhelming sense of this was so much bigger than us, and that through this tragedy we could express love and support for each other and be there for each other. All along the way, the family had recommended to us to sing a hymn called Be Not Afraid. It was a hymn I had never heard before. After I listened to it and looked at it, I just fell in love with it. I shared it with our choir. They fell in love with it. It spoke so much to us in that moment, and it became almost an anthem for us in times of sorrow. It's one that we have sung at each of the following anniversaries of this tragedy, and it's a hymn that speaks that God is with us even in such terrible times, and it's one that we will continue to sing as we go on.
My community is located just east of downtown Toronto, and the church faces directly onto the Danforth, a popular street for restaurants and shops. On a Sunday evening in July of 2018, a man with a gun walked along the Danforth while people were strolling and sitting in cafes and opened fire. He wounded several people and took the lives of 2 young women. I learned about the shootings early the next morning when members of my choir started calling and emailing to find out if everyone in the congregation was okay. By 3 p.m. that day, I was at a meeting of local business leaders, faith leaders, and the local member of parliament to discuss how the community could come together to express their shock, remorse, and grief. Emotions were very high. Together, we decided to organize a community vigil that would happen just 2 days later. We initially imagined it as a small street corner gathering for a few hundred residents of the neighborhood, but in part because of the press coverage of the shooting, the vigil drew thousands of people. Because of our church's location directly in the path of the shooter, the minister of my church and I were heavily involved in helping to shape the vigil, and we shared in the leadership of it. There were many competing voices who wanted to shape the tone of the public events in the days following the shooting. My priority was to create spaces where the community could voice its lament through shared song. It occurred to me that there were different circles of people I needed to consider. There were the broader public who would attend, made up of people of many backgrounds and faith traditions who would not necessarily have a repertoire of song in common. There was also my own church and choir community who were processing this trauma that occurred at our doorstep. And I mean that literally. We had police caution tape across our main entrance and bullet holes in our church sign. I invited members of our choir and congregation to meet in front of the damaged sign in the hour before the big vigil. We stood together and sang simple songs of comfort, sorrow, and anger, such as Singing for Our Lives, which you heard earlier. I chose songs that could be picked up easily by rote, some of which were familiar already in our community and others which I taught to the gathered crowd. We also sang through the song I had selected for the big vigil gathering, which allowed us to seed the crowd with people familiar with the song. Some of the songs I chose for inclusion in that informal time of singing were Comfort Me, which is words and music by Mimi Bornstein-Dobel. Comfort me, O my soul. It goes, comfort me,
Comfort me, O my soul,
etc. And you can change the words to be walk with me, weep with me, lean on me, speak for me, all of these things. So that was one that allowed a moment of comfort and shared mutual holding up. Another was Lay Me Low by Daniel Schwant, which I learned through my work with Music That Makes Community. It goes, lay me low where God can find me. Lay me low where God can hold me. Lay me low where God can bless me. Lay me low, oh lay me low. It can be taught call and echo, and in my case I chose to make the lyric lay me low where love can find me, to make it a little more multi-faith and sacred secular together. We also sang Live in Charity, Ubi Caritas of the Taizé community, and Don't Be Afraid from the Iona community. After that time of singing, we crossed the street to join the big vigil gathering. Our faith leaders spoke to the immense crowd, naming the community's pain. We all walked the path of the attack, and we sang together. As the vigil began, I taught the song Peace, Salam, Shalom to the crowd. I chose it because the lyrics and melody are easily learned by rote, and it means peace in 3 languages that our local community speaks. I taught it by breaking down the melody into chunks and indicating the contour of the melody with gesture, keeping my explanations to a minimum. The crowd readily responded to the teaching and sang along. I'll share that song with you now. Peace, Salam, Shalom is by the activist singer-songwriter duo Pat Humphries and Sandy O, who are also called Emma's Revolution. Their work has been described as beauty, power, and ferocity all mixed together with love and hope.
Peace, Salam, Shalom. Peace, Salam, Shalom. Peace, Salam, Shalom.
I had a similar opportunity to lead the community in song 1 year later on the anniversary evening of the shooting. Together with a small group of singers, I led songs of comfort and peace at an evening vigil memorializing the anniversary. Both of these events confirmed for me the power of community singing to draw people together in moments of stress and sadness. I vividly remember a tense, uneasy feeling amongst the crowd as I arrived to prepare for the vigil. But as we sang our songs together, I felt that tension ease. It was a palpable reminder that shared song can be a catalyst, dissolving our feelings of alienation and mistrust. One more experience showed me how community singing creates space for healing in the wake of an event like this. I was invited to bring together a pickup choir to sing at the city's public anniversary memorial. It was in the middle of the summer when my choir is on break, so I extended the invitation to the wider community, hoping that I could organize a choir of a dozen or so. As it happened, 80 singers joined in, most of whom were not from my choir and some of whom had never sung in a choir before. We sang Mark Miller's I Choose Love.
Of war, I choose peace.
The event was a reminder to me that in the wake of traumatic events like this one, people are looking for points of connection and ways to contribute to the healing of their community. So if you do find yourself in this situation, here are a few strategies you might use to move through the days and weeks that follow, and ideas for helping your community to sing through a tragedy like this one. So your response to this event will depend on the context of your own situation, your congregation, and on the wider community, on who is wanting to be part of it and in what way. There were a few ways that we responded in my own community to this event. One was that we hosted a church service that focused on expressing grief and anger as well as loss and hope following the event. And I structured it as a bit of almost a lessons and carols style format. So it was a series of readings around grief, and there were psalms of lament and hope, as well as poetry and song. One resource that was enormously helpful for me in planning this event was the Hymn Society resource, Hymns in Times of Crisis, which is available on the Hymn Society website. And what the service focused on was highlighting moments of lament, of anguish, peace, and healing in the witness of Scripture as a way of holding space for our own pain, our doubt, and our sense of injustice. The story of Scripture is one of a people who are beloved by God, but beset by oppression, fear, and doubt. So as I said in my comments opening the service, the biblical narrative is an account of a people in dialogue with their Creator, railing against moments of injustice, crying out for help in times of pain, demanding an answer from a God who at times seems maddeningly silent. These are all things that people might be feeling in the days after a trauma like this one. And yet, Scripture promises over and over that God is with us in every joy and sorrow, and that's what we tried to highlight with that service. You might also host some kind of informal gathering for members of your congregation or also the wider community, and have a selection of familiar hymns and songs to sing or take requests. Our sanctuary was open in the days following the event for anyone who wanted to come and sit and be still, and song would be a natural way of helping people move through that if that was how you wanted to go.
And don't forget, of those who are involved with doing the services, especially if you have a choir that's doing things as I did, they may need a special time for themselves, separate from the services, that they can have that moment of grief. And we'll talk more about that later, but sometimes we're not able to ourselves grieve when we're leading others. The response, which was right for each of our communities, was a large-scale event open to the wider community. In HILARY'S case, a community vigil drawing members of the public, and in my case, a public memorial service. This falls under things they didn't teach you in church musician school. Each of these were unique to our own communities. Here is what you might think through if you need to prepare a similar event. When thinking about who this is for, this could be for your congregation, multiple congregations, local community, greater community. Will this be a service that is to honor one person, multiple people? Is it a funeral, a healing service? It's important to connect to those impacted greatest by this if possible, and find out what's important to them. Music that was important to those killed, songs that speak to the families. In our case, during the offertory, Carmen's piano teacher played one of the pieces she'd been working on months to prepare, and everyone who was close to her knew her playing this piece. And it was something very powerful, but also something easy to convey to others.
I think one of the things that we were really concerned with was that we've done events in the community before as our church, as our congregation, but we were very aware that it was a wide swath of the public who were going to come to this event. So I wanted to think through, these gathered people won't have the same assumptions as a congregation might. This is the public, and they will possibly be expecting this to be secular. And I wanted to leave space for people for whom faith is an important way of expressing these things, but also leave room that that's not everyone's experience.
Yeah. And for us, first and foremost, this was a funeral, so respecting her parents and her family's wishes was always first and foremost in whatever we did.
Mm-hmm.
When you're planning a service or a vigil, you want to think about, what is the purpose? Are you gathered there to mourn? Are you there to honor? Are you there to call for justice? To unite a new community? To bring healing? Or most likely some mix of all of those? With us, it was a funeral. But because being open to the greater community, it was more on the lines of a state funeral, something that was involving people from all across the community, dignitaries and so forth. Of course, still respecting the family's wishes. In Hilary's case, this was a vigil that was there to bring healing to the entire community. There'll be many kinds of raw emotions that everyone will be experiencing. And so how do you channel that into something that is healthy and brings healing?
I remember at the time when you were going through this experience, you talking about how that idea that this was like a state funeral was so important to how you understood the task that you had in front of you, because it's this idea that this is more than just, it is a service of the church. It's a moment to have a memorial, but it feels bigger, more public, and that it's important moment for the healing of the whole community. So that was interesting that you framed it that way.
Yeah, and we forget that something like this really does impact our whole community, even though I'm sure a lot of people at that funeral service did not know Carmen personally. They were part of our community, and we were all impacted.
I think in our case too, this idea that it was open to the community meant that we had to balance issues of what are the expectations around this event. So some of us felt very strongly that we needed a moment of collective lament. We needed the opportunity to gather and weep and have the possibility of moving toward healing. But there were also concerns about this had been a very public happening. It was when people were out at cafes and restaurants, and there were others who were more concerned that people feel comfortable going to businesses in the area and feel like they could shop. And we were balancing those concerns, and I had to move through that and find ways to allow the music to still create the space and the impact that I felt the community needed it to have.
And one kind of unusual thing for us is that we were one of many funerals. There were several people killed in our case, and there were people at the funeral who had probably already been to 4 or 5 funerals, and maybe even one that same day. So it was a continuation process, and not just something that set as its own.
Yeah, exhausting.
Yeah. When thinking about who will be involved, who will be there, we want to think of maybe the immediate family, in my case, close close friends of the person who has died, church family, school friends, and members of the broader community. And in our case, we ended up also having local dignitaries and officials. So quite a broad range of people, both very closely connected to Carmen and people who are connected to the community. And so therefore, we're drawn to this.
Ours was similar, but it was very much an event that the local community people needed a moment to express. The families weren't there, although everyone was trying to be respectful of those families. But again, it was business owners, it was the local member of parliament, local politicians, and many, many, many members of the public.
Music that may resonate strongly with one group may fall flat with another. Explaining something's importance can be helpful as long as it doesn't take too much time and become too tedious to explain, maybe using insider language or having to explain certain things. Like I mentioned before, having the piano teacher play Carmen's favorite piece that she'd been working hard was easy enough to put a bulletin point, in the service order so people could see that and they were impacted. Whereas something that maybe we did as a choir would be important to us as a choir, but maybe not resonate as well with the broader community. So you want to be mindful that you don't have to explain in too detail if it's not something that's easily accessible to others.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's room for explanation and context, but I think these are things that we can tend to do off the cuff, and for an event like this, I think it's important to think them through ahead of time, think about what the moment is going to demand, whether this is a moment to let a piece of music stand on its own, or whether some context and explanation would be helpful for everyone to access it in the way that's intended.
Exactly. And, for us, that involved using some hymns that were familiar to most people. We ended with Amazing Grace, and it was one of those powerful moments because it's a hymn that speaks to everyone, whether they're churched or not. They're familiar with that hymn. Other hymns maybe, are familiar and so forth, but some things may be a little bit unique, and you want to be mindful of how that will resonate with the people that you're trying to impact.
Another thing you'll want to consider is how you envision that the community will get involved. What is your hope? What kind of space are you wanting to leave for song to lead them into whatever moment is called for? For me, it was important that the people gathered at our vigil walk be enabled to sing all together with an immediacy and an immediate impact, not without teaching, but without a lot of needing to get into fine details. So I chose a song that I could teach by rote, which could be sung immediately. At the same time, my choir members who were there knew the song already and knew the harmonies, and that was an intentional choice because they were able to add to the sound, they could sing in harmony, and that allowed people around them kind of permission, hearing those voices, hearing that sound, to maybe harmonize with the melody themselves and to enter into the song a little more deeply. We found in our case a lot of the leadership of the event that we put together, so community business stakeholders, politicians, they were the kind of people who were largely unfamiliar with the idea of congregational singing, of community singing, and very unfamiliar with the idea of someone teaching a song as part of a public event. But I knew what I could do. I knew what I could expect of the crowd and how impactful it would be. So I encourage you to think about advocating for what you know how to do. Advocate for the role of the song leader, whatever that looks like in your case. Have confidence that it will work, and don't be afraid to explain your role to people who might not be familiar with that kind of idea. And at the same time, it's a matter of teaching with confidence so that the community, even if they've never sung together before, have that trust in you and draw from your confidence.
In my case, I was fortunate to have my choir, combined choir with others, and musicians from our church and other churches involved. So we were able to balance both the congregational element with music provided by choir and musicians. So it gave a back and forth. So there was a time where the congregation was singing, a time where they could be in a little bit more of a meditative state, like listening to HILARY'S Requiem, or later in the end when we did Gaelic Blessing from John Rutter, a little bit more time where they can spend in prayer, letting the music surround them. And then taking the time for hymns that they were familiar. On Eagle's Wings was one that I think was easily picked up by the congregation. As I mentioned before, Be Not Afraid was one of those hymns that was unfamiliar to us, but quickly we were able to pick up, and the congregation likewise was able to pick up, and were singing, with their full spirit. And so, thinking about those mixes of people that you may have, that will lead to maybe you can use some elements through performers, choir, musicians that can aid while also giving the congregation a time for them to also express themselves.
Yeah, and that give and take that you're describing, I think, is so important, because with events like this, not to put too fine a point on it, but people are going to have different levels of emotion at different times. People may fall apart at different times to each other, and if there is that give and take of some singing, some listening, you can move through that and experience that grief and know that you'll be able to pick yourself up later and join back in. So that was really well thought out.
Yeah.
So in our case, we were very happy to offer the use of our sanctuary for the gathering, but it was felt that for an interfaith and a public event, this wouldn't strike quite the right tone for our needs. And in the end, it would have been far too small. So ours was outside as a march. And an event in a cathedral will send a very different message about who is invited, who is involved, than will a street corner. And for me, because our event was outside, I wanted the music to have the sense of purpose and drive of almost of a protest march, because in amongst the grief, there were also senses of injustice and crying out for hope. So that shaped my choice of repertoire, because I wanted the songs to have an immediacy for the people gathered.
And, our case, similarly, our sanctuary was going to be too small. Early on in the planning stages, we realized that there were going to be much more than the 400 people that we could sit. And so our rector was able to make an arrangement with St. Andrew's Catholic Church in Coral Springs, which seats 2,200 people. And as wonderful that was, this was a new space for our choir, who was used to singing in a much smaller space. So to have that larger area to be able to fill and sing in, and how that feels and how that sounds, were all things that we had to quickly adapt to. And those are things that, you want to make sure you understand who is going to be helping you with recording and with microphone placement. If you have singers that are doing a solo, or an instrumentalist doing a solo, where should they stand? All the things that from your space, you may have to quickly reorganize and reevaluate in the moment.
Our vigil walk took place 3 days after the shooting, and it unfolded amid a lot of media attention, a lot of media scrutiny. So I was very mindful that my words and my choices of music would be broadcast on the news and scrutinized on a wider scale. And I had a similar experience a year later, ahead of the anniversary vigil. And if you find that you're approached for a media interview, or you think that might be a possibility, I encourage you to take a few minutes to jot down important points that you want to include when the interview occurs, so that you can speak very concisely and get right to the point. It can be helpful to sort of think in sound bites. And also do double check with the interviewer whether it's being recorded for broadcast or just being recorded for the interviewer's own notes. I had an issue where I thought that I was talking to a reporter who was writing down notes, but the interview was actually for the radio, and I would have spoken differently if I'd known that a recording of my voice was going straight onto the radio. So that's something to keep in mind.
On the opposite side, the family of Carmen requested that there be absolutely no media at the funeral. And something we had to take into consideration was having people, screening for media types that may be trying to enter, and informing them that although they may attend, they could not record, they could not, no video recordings, no audio recordings were to be permitted. It was even to the extreme that the local police brought their anti-drone gun to shoot down any potential drones that may be, trying to grab video from above.
And yeah, it's so difficult because it's such an overwhelming situation already, and then to be thinking about media attention at the same time can seem really overwhelming. And I think that's why it can be good to just take a few moments to think these things through ahead of time. When I looked back at my notes and realized that the vigil was 3 days after the shooting, I couldn't believe the amount of the shortness of the time period, and that was because so much was compacted into those few days, and the media scrutiny really intensified that. So
you do want to be mindful of the trauma that everyone is going through during this process, and the things that they may be carrying, the baggage that they may also have from previous experiences that you may not know. And that includes yourself. I find that you have to be mindful of your own grief, your own feelings and emotions through this process. I know in my case, although maybe not recommended, I ended up kind of suppressing all my own personal grief until after it was over. And I remember collapsing into a margarita at Buffalo Wild Wings after the funeral was over and just letting it all just sink in of what had just happened. And the same thing goes when you're talking to your choir. As I mentioned before, you want to make sure they have a place where they can grieve. If they're involved with this, especially in our case, our choir, Carmen sang in our choir, so it was a very close personal loss, for all of us. And finding a time that we could just be together. I brought coffee and snacks, and we just sat there and talked instead of having a normal choir time afterwards. We just were with each other, and allowing that kind of space for those who are involved in the planning and those involved in leadership is also important. It's important to take care of yourself through all this. When you speak to people, you want to be mindful, especially in our case. Say that you were talking to a child that was there, but were lucky enough not to be in the wrong place, Their friend wasn't lucky enough. And so you want to be very sensitive about their feelings. You want to be sensitive to those who maybe didn't go to school that day. And so, it's one of those things to take that extra moment, think about what you say before you say it, and listen. Listening is vitally important through something like this. Listening to the needs of the family, listening to the needs of your community, and just being receptive that we all experience these things differently, and we can learn from each other and help each other through this process.
yeah, I had the same experience, the idea that you sort of have to push your own feelings about everything aside in the name of doing what needs to be done for your community. And I think it's a time when that extra amount of grace for everyone around you and for yourself is absolutely vital, and that can be hard to keep in mind during a difficult time.
So when you're preparing for the ceremony, it's important to take into consideration the technology needed so that people can hear. In our case, again, we were in a large sanctuary, much larger than what we're used to, and the choir singing in our sanctuary would not need to be mic'd for those in attendance to be able to hear them clearly, but in this space that became very important. And so making sure your mic placements are good. And I can't say enough, if you're using someone else's space, find out the person who normally does the audio in that space, whether it's a sound technician or in a church, maybe their church musician will be a good point of contact for that. They're going to know their space, and they'll be more than willing. And I think we've stressed this all throughout. People want to help you. So if you ask for it, they will help you. Let them know, hey, what do I need to be mindful of? What's unique about this space? Where should we have people stand? Where should the microphones be? They will help you with that. Something else to consider, if you're going to have overflow seating and so forth, is there going to be another space, in that same building outside where you want that sound to be broadcast? And again, if that's the case, then you want to make sure everything that's happening is near a microphone. Because even if the people in the sanctuary could hear just fine, those who may be in an extended area may not be able to. And always, 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 if you're in someone else's space, whether it's a church, a public hall, wherever, be a good guest. Be respectful. Always ask before you move stuff. I know that sounds silly, but if you turn the tables and someone was coming into your space and started just ripping everything apart and moving things, think of how you would want to be treated in that situation. And again, let people help you.
In our case, with the outdoor element, that the vigil was outside, there was a large sound system for public broadcast that was brought. But even that being the case, because the crowd was so much larger than intended, the sound system wasn't adequate for the task, and much of the opening part of the ceremony couldn't be heard because the amplification just wasn't loud enough. And even unforeseen events added to that issue. There were police helicopters flying overhead, and that added to the drowning out of the sound. So that was a real issue because people had come to be a part of this, to be connected to what was going on. And if you were more than however many meters back, you couldn't hear. So that was an issue that I was sure to address a year later at the anniversary vigil. We made sure that we had a sound system that was equal to the task. But these are the kinds of things that you won't necessarily be expecting, but that can make or break people's experience at a really intense time. So equally important as the music you choose is how you will address the people who are gathered. Take some time ahead of time to think about how you want to introduce the music. I think we've said above, often less is more in terms of explanation, but still think it through. Think whether any contextual details are necessary. And if you're going to teach something by rote, think through how you will approach teaching it, how the song breaks down, how you want to line it out or sing the melody in chunks if you're going to do that. Consider teaching it to a friend as a practice or in front of the mirror. It helps a lot. I think also in terms of addressing a large group of people who aren't normally your community, it's important to be mindful that how we lead a song, that we don't amplify existing prejudices or imbalances of power, particularly in cases where media coverage might make the event more widely seen. And also because in times of stress and grief, even an offhand comment can be really re-traumatizing for people who are already in pain. One thing I'm thinking of is in terms of gendered language in addressing gathered singers. So try to refer to people as high voices and low voices in place of women and men. Address the crowd in neutral language as much as possible, friends, beloved, and so on. Also, consider the kind of hurt that the community is processing and how your choice of repertoire can be a source of healing and a prophetic word in that specific regard of whatever one's going through. So if in our case, the Danforth shooting spurred a certain amount of anti-Muslim sentiment because of the identity of the shooter. And so Peace, Salam, Shalom, the song I chose to lead, was very deliberately chosen to affirm that we all wished for peace in our communities across those cultural and language lines.
We also had to take in consideration that as doing a funeral mass, it was a Eucharistic service. and being able to speak to those in attendance. And of course, as I mentioned, we were in a Catholic church as an Episcopalian congregation. We were very thankful, very blessed that the Archbishop of the Catholic Diocese of Miami gave special dispensation to allow us to have Eucharist at their altar. And in a very, very unusual move, but something of strong solidarity, I allowed the Monsignor of the parish to stand at the altar with our rector during the celebration of the Eucharist. And so, speaking to those in attendance of what the Eucharist is and who may participate, and as Episcopalians, for us it's all baptized believers, but in that moment we made sure that all felt that they were welcomed, and if they were uncomfortable, that there would be a blessing for those who did not want to participate but want to be included in the spirit of community, which was so vital to us in that moment.
That's so important. That's so important to have space for that in a moment like this. And I think in our case, there was another song that we used that speaks to this same idea of responding to violence and hatred with love in place of those traumatic feelings. And it was Olam Chesed Yibane, which translates from Hebrew to "We will build this world from love." It was written by Rabbi Menachem Creditor for his daughter, who was born in the days following the September 11th attacks on the World Trade Center. And it was taught to me by Rabbi Miriam Margles of Danforth Jewish Circle, who share our worship space with us, and we used it on that day. Friends, going through this experience was a steep learning curve for me. I know it was for Andrew as well. And if you're ever standing in my shoes, there are a couple of thoughts we each want you to have to learn from our experience. What I took away from this was that singing our grief can transform fear into solidarity and hope and healing. But it's important not to assume that you already know what the community will need. Come very prepared to listen.
In my case, the biggest thing I learned is don't be afraid to ask for help. In a situation like this, everyone, and absolutely everyone, is looking for a way to help, to express themselves, to be able to be a part of this. And so just saying to them, I need direction, I have a question, is this something that you can help me with? Of course, they're going to say yes if they can, and if it's at all possible. In my case, finding an organist from another parish and choir members to come to assist us, being in a new space, having the music director there help us figure out what we need to do, having my friends to rely on, talking to Dr. Hahn, all these resources that we sometimes take for granted are there just at a quick text message or phone call away. So don't be afraid to ask. Be willing, be open. Remember that you're not alone.
Thank you so much for watching. We'd like to leave you with a song today. Another song that was used at my vigil was "Fear Not the Pain." It was written by Rachel Crow of Music That Makes Community, which is a group that informs a lot of my work, and it's arranged by Peter Amidon. And it's a text setting a portion of a poem by Rainer Maria Rilke from Sonnets to Orpheus.